This story is inspired by real-life situations and includes fictional elements for entertainment. Not recommended for viewers under 18.
There was no shouting, no shattered glass, no desperate questions thrown into the dark. When Adrian Cole found out his wife was sleeping with another man, he made them coffee the next morning, like nothing had changed. And that was the beginning of the end. The house on Alder Street was the kind people slowed down to look at. Clean lines, large windows, soft, warm lighting that spilled onto the sidewalk in the evenings. It looked like a place where people talked over dinner, laughed in the kitchen, shared quiet mornings with coffee and sunlight. But inside, silence had been growing for a long time. Adrian Cole stood in the kitchen at 6:12 a.m., grinding coffee beans with mechanical precision. The low hum of the machine filled the air, replacing what used to be conversation. He didn't rush. He rarely did anymore. Upstairs, the shower turned on. Megan was awake. He glanced at the clock, then back at the coffee maker. There was a time when mornings meant something, when they would brush past each other in the hallway, when she'd steal his mug because it somehow made coffee taste better, when small touches felt natural instead of negotiated. Now, everything felt scheduled, even silence. By the time Megan came downstairs, dressed in a fitted navy blazer and heels she used to reserve for important meetings, Adrian had already poured her coffee. "Thanks," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Big day?" he asked, leaning lightly against the counter. "Just meetings." A pause. "Lucas is presenting the Q3 strategy." Adrian nodded once. Right, Lucas. The name had entered the home casually at first. A coworker, a talented one, someone Megan respected, then admired, then mentioned a little too often. Adrian hadn't questioned it, not them. Megan grabbed her bag, checked her phone, her thumb lingering on the screen for a second longer than necessary. A small detail, the kind most people would miss. Adrian didn't. "You'll be late tonight?" he asked. "Probably," she said quickly. "We're reviewing numbers after the presentation." He watched her as she spoke. Not suspiciously, not angrily, just carefully. "All right," he said. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, like she might say something more. Then she didn't. She walked past him, the faint scent of her perfume trailing behind, the scent he remembered choosing with her years ago. The front door closed softly, and just like that, the house returned to silence. Adrian didn't go to work immediately. Instead, he sat at the dining table, Megan's untouched coffee cooling in front of him. He stared at it, not because it mattered, but because it represented something that used to. He tried to pinpoint when things had changed. There wasn't a single moment, no dramatic turning point, just a slow erosion. Late nights turned into routine, conversations turned into logistics, touch turned into absence. Love didn't disappear, it thinned. His phone buzzed, a message from his colleague about a design revision. Adrian glanced at it, typed a brief response, then set the phone down again. Another buzz. This time it wasn't his phone. It was Megan's iPad, left on the kitchen counter. He wasn't the kind of man who went through his wife's things. Not out of principle, just out of trust. Or maybe habit. But the screen lit up again. A notification. A name. Lucas Bennett. Adrian didn't move at first. The message preview lingered for just a second before fading. Last night was... The rest was hidden. The house felt different suddenly. Not louder, not tenser, just clearer. Adrian stood up slowly and walked over to the counter. He didn't rush, didn't hesitate either. He picked up the iPad. For a long moment he simply held it. Then, with a calm that would later disturb even himself, he unlocked it. The messages weren't subtle. They weren't careful. They weren't new. Photos, conversations, late-night confessions that blurred the line between emotional and physical long before they crossed it entirely. Adrian scrolled, not obsessively, not angrily, just thoroughly. He saw the progression, the curiosity, the validation, the excitement, then the shift, the dependency, the intimacy, the betrayal. There was one message that stood out, not because it was the worst, but because it was the clearest. "Megan, it feels different with you, Lucas, because I actually see you." Adrian exhaled slowly. He set the iPad back exactly where he found it. No dramatic reaction, no immediate conclusions, just understanding. That evening, Megan came home at 9:47 p.m. Adrian was in the living room, reading. "You're still up," she said, surprised. "Couldn't sleep." She slipped off her shoes, her movements slightly tense, like she was bracing for something. But nothing came. No accusations, no questions. "Presentation go well?" he asked. "Yeah, Lucas did great. A beat." "I'm glad," Adrian said. She studied him then, just for a moment, as if trying to read something beneath the surface. "Adrian, are you okay?" she asked. He looked up at her, and for the first time that day, there was something unreadable in his eyes. "I am," he said calmly. And he meant it, because the moment he stopped wondering was the moment everything started making sense. That night, as Megan slept beside him, Adrian stared at the ceiling. Not angry, not heartbroken, not even surprised anymore, just awake. He realized something, then something quiet but irreversible. He wasn't going to fight for this. He wasn't going to confront her. He wasn't even going to ask her to choose. Instead, he was going to help her leave. The rain started just after noon. In Seattle, it wasn't unusual, it was expected, almost comforting in its predictability. But that day, the rain felt heavier, like it carried weight, like it pressed against the windows of Adrian Cole's office, blurring the skyline into something distant and indistinct. Adrian barely noticed. He sat at his desk, a half-finished architectural model in front of him, his hands resting idly on either side of it. Normally, he would have been focused, precise, immersed in the quiet logic of structure and space. Today, his mind drifted. Not chaotically, not even anxiously, just elsewhere. His phone buzzed once, a message from Megan. "Megan, hey, can you grab my phone from the car? I think I left it there this morning. I need it for a call." Adrian stared at the message for a moment longer than necessary. Then he stood up, grabbed his coat, and headed out. The rain hit harder outside. By the time he reached the driveway of their house, his sleeves were damp, tiny droplets clinging to the fabric. Megan's car sat exactly where she'd left it, clean, polished, untouched by anything except the steady rhythm of falling rain. He unlocked it with a spare key. The interior smelled faintly of her perfume. There it was, her phone, resting in the center console. Adrian picked it up. For a brief second there was nothing unusual about the moment, just a husband retrieving something his wife had forgotten. Then the screen lit up. A notification. Lucas Bennett. Adrian didn't even realize he'd stopped breathing. The message appeared in full this time. "I keep thinking about this morning. About you." The rain outside seemed louder suddenly, drumming against the car roof in uneven patterns. Adrian's thumb hovered near the screen. There was still time to put it back, to pretend he hadn't seen it, to remain in that fragile space where doubt hadn't fully solidified into truth. But something inside him had already shifted. Not broken, shifted. He unlocked the phone. There was no resistance, no password he didn't know, no hidden apps, no attempt to conceal anything. That somehow made it worse. The messages were right there, open, continuous, intimate in a way that didn't belong to strangers or co-workers. Adrian scrolled, slowly, methodically, like a man reviewing blueprints, searching for structural flaws he already suspected were there. "Lucas, you left your earring in my place. Megan, keep it, something to remember me by." Adrian's jaw tightened, just slightly. Not enough to show, not enough to release anything. He kept reading. "Megan, I hate going home like nothing happened." "Lucas, then don't." "Megan, it's not that simple." The words weren't dramatic, they weren't poetic. They were worse, they were honest. There were photos too, nothing explicit, nothing undeniable in isolation. But together, they told a story. A hotel room, a blurred reflection in a mirror, 2 glasses of wine on a nightstand. Details, always the details. Adrian paused at one message thread, earlier than the others. Weeks ago. "Lucas, when did you realize?" "Megan, that I was unhappy?" "Lucas, that you were with the wrong person." "Megan, I think I've known for a while." Adrian exhaled slowly, the air leaving his lungs in a controlled, almost deliberate way. There it was, not the betrayal, not the affair, but the conclusion she had already reached long before he ever knew there was a question. He locked the phone, just like that. No shaking hands, no sudden anger, no desperate urge to call her, to demand an explanation, to shatter whatever illusion remained. Instead, Adrian sat there in the driver's seat, listening to the rain. He felt something, of course, but it wasn't what most people would expect. It wasn't rage, it wasn't heartbreak, it was clarity. When he stepped back into the house, he placed the phone on the kitchen counter, exactly where Megan would expect to find it. Then he texted her. "Adrian, got it, left it in the kitchen." 3 dots appeared almost immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. "Megan, thanks, nothing more." That evening, Adrian cooked dinner, not out of habit, not out of routine, but because it gave him something to do with his hands. The kitchen filled with the soft sounds of chopping vegetables, the low sizzle of oil in a pan, the quiet rhythm of something controlled, predictable, unlike everything else. Megan came home earlier than expected, 6:18 p.m. Adrian noticed the time immediately. She stepped inside, slightly out of breath, her eyes scanning the room before settling on him. "You got my phone?" she asked. "It's in the kitchen." She walked past him quickly, almost too quickly. Adrian didn't turn around, but he listened. The faint sound of her picking it up, a pause, silence, then a subtle shift in her breathing, barely noticeable unless you were paying attention. "Thanks," she said again, returning to the living room. Adrian looked up from his book. No problem. She stood there for a moment, like she wanted to say something or ask something. Instead, she forced a small smile. "Dinner smells good. It's almost ready." Another pause. "Did you need anything else from the car?" she asked carefully. Adrian met her eyes, for just a second. "No," he said calmly. "That was it." She nodded, too quickly. "Okay." Dinner was quiet, not tense, not uncomfortable, just empty. They talked about work, about a client Adrian was dealing with, about a minor issue Megan had with a campaign launch. Normal things, safe things, things that existed on the surface. At one point, Megan's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it instinctively, then hesitated, then turned it face down. Adrian noticed, of course he did, but he didn't react. He just took another bite of his food, chewing slowly, thoughtfully, observing. That night, Megan fell asleep faster than usual, her breathing steady, even, peaceful. Adrian lay beside her, staring into the darkness. The room felt different now, not because something had changed, but because something had been revealed. He turned his head slightly, looking at her, at the woman he had spent years building a life with, the woman who had already quietly begun building another one. Most people, in that moment, would feel an overwhelming need to act, to confront, to demand, to reclaim. Adrian felt none of that. Instead, a different thought settled into place. Quiet, precise, unshakable. If she had already chosen, then there was nothing left to fight for. But leaving wasn't the only option, and neither was pretending. Adrian closed his eyes, and for the first time since the discovery, a plan, if it could even be called that, began to form. Not driven by anger, not driven by revenge, but by something far more unsettling. Acceptance. He wasn't going to stop this. He wasn't going to expose it. He wasn't even going to interfere. He was going to watch, to understand, to see exactly how far it would go if no one stood in the way. Because sometimes the truth didn't need to be forced into the light. Sometimes you just had to let it unfold. There's a difference between knowing and understanding. Adrian learned that in the days that followed. Knowing was immediate, clean, almost clinical. Understanding, however, required time, observation, a willingness to look at things most people avoided, and Adrian had always been good at looking. It started with small adjustments, not obvious ones, nothing Megan could notice or question. He began leaving work a little earlier, not enough to raise suspicion, just enough to exist in the margins of her schedule, enough to see patterns. Megan's late nights weren't random, they had rhythm. Mondays and Thursdays she came home after 9. Tuesdays were inconsistent. Fridays almost always early, as if she were compensating, as if guilt had a calendar. Adrian didn't follow her, not physically. He didn't need to. The truth was already there, scattered across the quiet details she no longer paid attention to. Receipts in her bag, a rideshare notification that appeared briefly on her phone before she cleared it. The faint shift in her tone when she mentioned certain names. Lucas. The name had weight now. At work, Adrian did something he hadn't done in years. He searched. Not obsessively, not desperately, just deliberately. Lucas Bennett. The company website loaded easily. A clean headshot, confident smile, early 30s, maybe younger. Sharp features softened by an easy kind of charm. The kind that translated well in meetings, the kind that made people listen. His bio was exactly what Adrian expected. Strategic, driven, fast-rising. Someone who knew how to position himself, not just in business, but in life. Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying the image on the screen. There was no immediate resentment, no instinctive dislike. If anything, he understood it. Lucas represented something Adrian had stopped being. Or maybe something he had never tried to be. That night, Megan mentioned him again, casually, too casually. Lucas thinks we should pivot the campaign, she said over dinner, pushing food around her plate more than actually eating it. Adrian nodded. He's probably not wrong. Megan looked up, surprised. You agree? I haven't seen the data, Adrian said calmly, but people like him don't usually suggest things without reason. She studied him for a second longer than usual. People like him? She asked. Adrian took a sip of water, confident, decisive. It's useful in your field. Megan's expression shifted, something between curiosity and unease. Yeah, she said slowly. He is confident. Adrian noticed the way her voice softened, not dramatically, just enough. Later that night, he found her sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone, smiling, not at him, not at anything in the room, at something somewhere else. Long day? Adrian asked, leaning against the door. She looked up quickly, the smile fading just a fraction too late. Yeah, just catching up on messages, Adrian nodded. Of course, he didn't need to see the screen. He already knew. Days turned into a quiet routine of observation. Adrian wasn't gathering evidence. He wasn't building a case. He was learning. And what he learned wasn't just about Megan and Lucas. It was about Megan and Adrian. He started noticing things he had ignored for years. The way Megan lingered in conversations that made her feel heard. The way she reacted to spontaneity, how rare it had become in their life. The way she dressed differently on certain days. Not for attention, for anticipation. Adrian thought back to the early years of their marriage. There had been a time when Megan looked at him like that, when his presence alone shifted something in her, when conversations stretched late into the night, not because they had to, but because neither of them wanted them to end. When had that stopped? He tried to find the moment. He couldn't, because it hadn't stopped all at once. It had faded, gradually, quietly, like everything else. Adrian stood in his home office one evening, flipping through an old notebook he hadn't touched in years. Sketches, ideas, concepts that never made it past paper. He used to show these to Megan. She used to care. Or maybe she used to pretend to care. He sat down, staring at a half-finished design. Something ambitious, something bold, something he had abandoned. A thought surfaced then, uncomfortable but undeniable. Lucas wasn't just offering Megan something new. He was offering her something Adrian had stopped giving. Attention, unpredictability, a sense of being seen. Adrian leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. Not in frustration, in recognition. The affair wasn't the beginning of the problem, it was the result of it. That realization didn't excuse anything, but it explained everything. The next time Megan mentioned Lucas, Adrian did something different. He asked the question. What's he like? Adrian said casually. Megan hesitated. Like, at work? In general. She looked at him carefully, as if trying to understand the intent behind the question. He's easy to talk to, she said finally. He listens. Adrian nodded. That matters. Megan's expression shifted again, something softer this time, something almost vulnerable. Yeah, she said quietly. It does. They didn't say anything else after that. They didn't need to. That night, Adrian lay awake again. But this time, his thoughts weren't focused on the betrayal. They were focused on something far more difficult to confront. Himself. He had loved Megan, in his own way. In a steady, reliable, predictable way. The kind of love that built houses, paid bills, created stability. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing her. Not intentionally, not maliciously, just gradually. And now, someone else did. Adrian turned his head, looking at Megan as she slept. She looked peaceful, untroubled, like someone who hadn't yet been forced to confront the full weight of her choices. A strange calm settled over him then. Not acceptance, not yet, but something close. If this was what she needed, if this was what she had been missing, then maybe the question wasn't how to stop it. Maybe the question was, what happened when she finally got it? Adrian closed his eyes, and for the first time, he wasn't just observing the affair. He was studying its ending. Because every structure, no matter how carefully built, revealed its weaknesses eventually. And Adrian was very, very good at finding cracks. The shift didn't happen all at once. That was the unsettling part. If Adrian had shouted, accused, demanded, Megan would have understood. There would have been a shape to the conflict. A clear beginning, a middle, an end. But Adrian did none of that. Instead, he began to step back. It started with something small. Do you want me to pick you up tonight? He asked one morning, tying his watch as Megan stood by the door. She hesitated, just slightly. I might stay late, she said. It's uncertain. Adrian nodded, as if the answer didn't matter. Then don't worry about it. Take your time. There was no follow-up question, no subtle pressure disguised as concern. Just permission. Megan studied him for a moment. Okay, she said slowly. By the end of that week, the changes became harder to ignore. Adrian stopped asking when she would be home, stopped checking his phone when it got late, stopped filling silence with questions that used to sound like care, but now felt like obligation. In their place, he offered something else. Space. Hey, Megan said one evening, lingering in the kitchen as Adrian rinsed dishes. I was thinking, some of the team might go out after work tomorrow. Adrian didn't turn around immediately. That sounds good, he said, drying his hands calmly. You should go. Megan blinked. You don't mind? Adrian finally looked at her, his expression neutral, almost soft. Why would I? The question lingered longer than either of them expected. Because once upon a time, he would have. Megan gave a small, uncertain smile. Thanks. That night she stayed out until nearly midnight. Adrian was still awake when she came home, sitting in the living room with a book resting open on his lap. "You're up," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Couldn't sleep." She kicked off her heels, moving slower this time, less rushed, less guarded. "How was it?" he asked. "Good," she said. Then after a pause, Lucas was there. Adrian nodded once. "I figured." Megan waited for something, a reaction, a question, a flicker of discomfort. It didn't come. "Do you want to meet him?" she asked suddenly, the words escaping before she could pull them back. The room went still. Adrian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed his book carefully, placing it on the table beside him. "If that's something you want," he said, his voice even, "then sure." Megan stared at him. She hadn't expected that. Not the agreement, not the calm. "Maybe," she said quickly, almost retreating from her own suggestion, "it's just, he's part of my life." Adrian held her gaze. "I know." That was it. No accusation hidden beneath the words. No resentment disguised as politeness. Just acknowledgement. Megan turned away first. "Good night," she said, heading upstairs. "Good night." But sleep didn't come easily to her that night. Over the next few weeks, Adrian continued quietly, consistently to remove himself from the center of Megan's world. Not dramatically, not noticeably to anyone else. But to Megan, it felt like gravity had shifted. He stopped suggesting plans for the weekend. If she asked, he agreed. If she didn't, he made his own. "Hey," she said one Saturday morning, leaning against the doorway of his home office. "I might go into the city today. Just walk around. Clear my head." Adrian glanced up from his desk. "That sounds like a good idea. You don't want to come?" It wasn't a real invitation. They both knew that. Adrian smiled faintly. "I've got some work to finish." Megan nodded. "Right." She left an hour later, dressed more carefully than usual. Adrian noticed. Of course he did. But he didn't follow. Instead, he returned to something he hadn't touched in years, his work. Not the routine projects, not the predictable designs clients expected, but the ideas he had abandoned, the ones that required risk, attention, vision. As Megan's life expanded outward, Adrian's turned inward. He worked late into the evening, sketching, refining, building something that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with himself. When Megan came home that night, she found him in the same place, focused, quiet, entirely absorbed. "You've been here all day?" she asked. "Pretty much." She stepped closer, glancing at the sketches scattered across his desk. "These are new." "Yeah, they're different." Adrian leaned back slightly, following her gaze. "I guess I had time to think." Megan nodded, but something in her expression shifted, something uncertain. "You've been different too," she said carefully. Adrian looked at her. "In what way?" She hesitated. "I don't know, just less..." She trailed off. "Less what?" he asked. Megan searched for the word. "Present," she said finally. The irony hung in the air, quiet and sharp. Adrian considered her words, then nodded. "That's fair." Megan frowned slightly. "That's it? What do you want me to say?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Something." Adrian studied her for a long moment, then he said, gently, "You seem like you have a lot going on. I figured you needed space." Megan's expression softened and tightened at the same time. "I didn't say I needed space." "No," Adrian said calmly. "You didn't," but she had taken it anyway. Silence stretched between them, longer than usual, heavier than before. "Adrian," she started, but the words didn't come. Because for the first time, she didn't know what she wanted from him. He didn't help her find it. "I'm going to make some coffee," he said, standing up. "Do you want some?" Megan blinked, caught off guard by the normalcy of the question. "Yeah," she said quietly, "sure." As Adrian walked past her, she turned slightly, watching him. There was something unsettling about the way he moved now. Not distant, not cold, just detached. Like someone who had already let go of something he hadn't officially lost yet. That night, Megan lay awake long after Adrian had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, thinking. She had wanted freedom, space, something more, and now she had it. So why did it feel like something was slipping away? Downstairs, Adrian's sketches lay scattered across the desk. Lines and shapes forming something bold, something unfinished, something waiting to become real. Just like everything else. There was a point, subtle, almost invisible, when secrecy stopped feeling necessary. Megan didn't notice exactly when it happened, only that it did. At first, she had been careful, deleting messages, timing her replies, inventing reasons that sounded just believable enough. But over time, something shifted. Not because she stopped caring, but because Adrian stopped reacting. "Hey," she said one Thursday evening, slipping off her coat as Adrian stood by the kitchen island. "I'm going to stay in the city tonight. It's just easier with meetings early tomorrow." Adrian didn't even look up from the glass he was drying. "Okay." That was it. No pause, no question, no hesitation. Megan blinked. "You're okay with that?" Adrian set the glass down, finally meeting her eyes. "Should I not be?" The question wasn't defensive. It wasn't sarcastic. It was genuine. "I just thought," she stopped herself. "Never mind." Adrian gave a small nod. "Text me when you get there." She did. An hour later, Megan checked in. "Adrian, good. Sleep well." That night, Megan didn't sleep much. Not because of guilt, because of something stranger. Lucas's apartment was warm, dimly lit, filled with the quiet confidence of someone who curated his space carefully. Music played softly in the background, something instrumental, something unobtrusive. "You're quiet," Lucas said, watching her from across the room. "Just tired." He smiled slightly. "You don't look tired." Megan forced a small smile back, but her thoughts drifted. To Adrian. To the way he hadn't asked a single question. He knows, doesn't he? The thought surfaced suddenly, uninvited. She pushed it away just as quickly. If he knew, he would have said something. He would have done something. But Adrian did nothing. "Stay tonight," Lucas said, stepping closer. Megan hesitated. Only for a second. Then she nodded. The line had already been crossed. This was just distance. Days turned into weeks, and Megan stopped pretending. Not completely, but enough. She no longer rushed home, no longer crafted elaborate explanations, no longer checked Adrian's reactions with the same careful attention, because there were no reactions. One evening, she sat across from him at dinner, scrolling through her phone openly. A message came in. She smiled. Adrian noticed. Of course he did. "Lucas?" he asked casually. Megan looked up, caught off guard. "Yeah, a bit. You don't mind me saying his name, do you?" she added, almost testing. Adrian took a slow sip of water. "Why would I?" Megan held his gaze, searching for something, anything. She found nothing. "Right," she said quietly. But that emptiness, it didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like something else, something colder. Meanwhile, Adrian's world continued expanding in a different direction. The invitation came through work, a client event, networking, something he would have declined months ago. This time he accepted. The venue was a rooftop bar overlooking the city glass steel and carefully controlled elegance. The kind of place where conversations were half business, half performance. Adrian moved through the crowd with quiet ease, observing, listening, existing just enough to belong. And then, "Adrian?" He turned, and there he was, Lucas Bennett. For a brief moment, time seemed to narrow, not dramatically, just enough to make everything else fade into the background. Lucas stepped forward, extending a hand. "Lucas Bennett, we haven't met, but I think we have someone in common." Adrian looked at him, really looked. The confidence, the composure, the subtle curiosity behind his eyes. Then Adrian took his hand. Adrian Cole. The handshake was firm, measured, neither man trying to prove anything, and yet, everything was there. "Small world," Lucas said lightly. "It usually is." A pause settled between them, not awkward, not comfortable, something in between. "I've heard a lot about you," Lucas continued. Adrian raised an eyebrow slightly. "Only good things, I hope." Lucas smiled. "Depends who you ask." Adrian almost smiled back. They stood there for a moment longer, two men connected by something neither of them acknowledged out loud. "So," Adrian said finally, "you work with Megan?" It wasn't a question. Lucas nodded. "Yeah, she's impressive." The word lingered, carefully chosen. "She is," Adrian said, and he meant it. Lucas studied him then, just for a second longer than politeness required, as if trying to understand something that didn't quite make sense. "You two have been married a while, right?" Lucas asked. 10 years. Lucas let out a low breath. "That's rare." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "Is it?" Lucas didn't answer immediately, because suddenly the conversation felt less casual, more precise. "I guess it depends on how you define it," Lucas said finally. Adrian nodded. "That's true." Another pause, longer this time, heavier. Neither man mentioned the obvious. Neither man needed to, because in that moment, they both understood exactly where they stood. "Anyway," Lucas said, stepping back slightly, "it was good meeting you." "You too." Lucas hesitated, then added, "Megan's lucky." The words hung in the air, ambiguous, layered. Adrian held his gaze for just a second, then said, calmly, "I think she's figuring that out." Lucas didn't respond. He didn't need to. because something in Adrian's tone, something quiet, something unshakable, had shifted the balance of the conversation in a way Lucas couldn't quite explain. Later that night, Adrian stood alone by the edge of the rooftop, looking out over the city lights. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even unsettled. If anything, he felt certain. Because now, the abstract had become real. The unseen had taken form. And Lucas Bennett was exactly who Adrian expected him to be. Nothing more, nothing less. At home, Megan lay awake again, her phone resting on her chest, a message from Lucas still open. But her mind wasn't with him. It was with Adrian, with the way he had said nothing, done nothing, fought for nothing. And for the first time, that didn't feel like freedom. It felt like loss. The night Adrian chose to speak, nothing felt different. That was what made it inevitable. Dinner had been quiet. Not unusually quiet, just the kind they had grown used to. The soft clink of cutlery, the occasional mention of work, the careful avoidance of anything real. Megan talked about a campaign launch. Adrian nodded in the right places. Two people performing a version of a life that had already ended. Afterward, Megan stood by the sink, rinsing her plate. Adrian watched her for a moment from the dining table. There was no anger in his chest, no tightness in his jaw, just a stillness. Megan. She turned slightly, surprised by the way he said her name. Not louder, not sharper, just intentional, yeah? Adrian stood up, walking toward her slowly. We should talk. Her hands paused under the running water, just for a second. Then she turned it off. About what? She asked, though something in her voice already knew. Adrian leaned lightly against the counter, not too close, not distant either. About you, he said calmly, and Lucas. Silence, complete, immediate. Megan didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe, it seemed. How long have you known? She asked finally, her voice quieter than he had ever heard it. Adrian didn't hesitate. Long enough. She closed her eyes briefly, her shoulders tightening, then releasing. She stopped, because suddenly none of the rehearsed explanations mattered. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, she said instead. Adrian nodded slightly. I believe you. That made her look up, confused, almost unsettled. You do? Yes. The simplicity of the answer disarmed her. She had expected anger, accusations, something she could push against. But Adrian gave her nothing to fight. I was going to tell you, Megan said quickly, as if trying to reclaim something. I just didn't know how. Adrian studied her. You didn't know how, he repeated. Not mocking, not doubting, just acknowledging. I didn't want to hurt you, she added, softer now. A small pause, then Adrian said, You already did. The words weren't sharp, they weren't heavy, they were true. Megan swallowed, her throat tightening. I know, she whispered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt clearer than it had in years. Adrian exhaled slowly. I read the messages, he said. Megan's eyes flickered. All of them? Enough. She looked away, shame finally breaking through the surface. I understand why, Adrian continued. That made her look back again. Why? She asked, almost defensively. Because I stopped seeing you, he said simply. The words landed harder than anything else he could have said. Megan blinked. What? Adrian didn't raise his voice, didn't shift his posture. I stopped paying attention. I stopped asking questions that mattered. I stopped being present in the ways that you needed. Megan shook her head slightly. That's not Adrian. That doesn't justify. It doesn't, he said calmly. I'm not justifying it. He held her gaze. I'm explaining it. The distinction settled between them, clear, unavoidable. Megan's eyes filled, but no tears fell. Then why didn't you say something? She asked, her voice breaking just enough to reveal the confusion underneath. Why didn't you fight for us? There it was, the question she had been carrying without realizing it. Adrian was quiet for a moment, then he said, Because you had already left. The room seemed to shrink around them. I'm still here, Megan said quickly, almost desperately. Adrian shook his head. No, he said gently, you're not. Silence again. Heavier this time. I met him, Adrian added. Megan froze. What? At the event last week, he said. Lucas. Her mind scrambled, trying to piece together something she hadn't expected. What happened? Adrian thought about it for a second. Nothing, he said. We talked. That's it? That's it. Megan stared at him, waiting, for something more, a hidden meaning, a deeper implication. There's no competition here, Megan, Adrian said quietly. The words hit differently than she expected. Not insulting, not dismissive, just final. I'm not trying to win you back, he continued, and I'm not trying to lose you either. Then what are you doing? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian looked at her, really looked, for the first time in a long time. I'm letting you go. The sentence settled into the room like something irreversible. Megan's breath caught. You're just giving up? Adrian shook his head again. No. A pause. I'm choosing not to hold on to something that's already gone. Her chest tightened. That's not fair. Adrian's expression didn't change. Neither is what we've been doing. Megan took a step back, as if the space between them might help her think. This isn't how it's supposed to go, she said, almost to herself. How is it supposed to go? Adrian asked. She didn't have an answer. You were supposed to be angry, she said instead. You were supposed to care more. Adrian's eyes softened slightly. I do care, he said. Then why does it feel like you don't? Because anger would have been easier. Because anger meant there was still something to fight for. Because anger meant she still mattered in the way she used to. But Adrian didn't say any of that. Instead, he said, because I'm not trying to keep you anymore. The truth of it was unbearable. Megan finally felt it then. Not guilt, not even regret. Loss. What happens now? She asked, her voice small in a way it hadn't been in years. Adrian glanced toward the window, the dark reflection staring back at him. We figure out how to end this, without destroying everything else. Megan let out a shaky breath. And us? Adrian looked back at her. There was no hesitation. There is no us, he said quietly. The finality of it didn't come with raised voices, or tears, or broken glass. Just silence. The kind that doesn't ask for anything anymore. Megan stood there, unable to move. Because for the first time since it all began, she understood something she hadn't wanted to face. Adrian hadn't lost her. He had already let her go. And there was nothing left to hold on to. Reality doesn't collapse all at once. It fractures quietly, through missed calls, unfinished conversations, and the slow realization that what once felt intense was never built to last. For Megan, it began with mornings. Lucas was different in daylight. At night, he had been effortless attentive, present, almost magnetic in the way he focused entirely on her. In those hours, the world narrowed to just the two of them, and everything felt heightened, meaningful. But mornings exposed things. He checked his phone more. He moved faster. He listened less. You're up early, Megan said one morning, wrapping a blanket around herself as she stepped into his kitchen. Lucas glanced at her briefly, already dressed. Big day, he said, distracted. Client review. She nodded, lingering there, waiting for something more. A question, a pause, an acknowledgement. It didn't come. I made coffee, she offered. Thanks, he said, grabbing the cup without really looking at her. The silence that followed felt unfamiliar, not heavy, not tense, just empty. Megan told herself it was normal. People had lives, responsibilities, real-world pressures that didn't disappear just because something felt exciting. That was all this was, adjustment. But the pattern didn't change. Lucas cancelled plans more often than he kept them. Something came up. Work's insane this week. Rain check? At first, Megan understood. Then she adapted. Then she started waiting. One evening she sat alone at a restaurant table for 23 minutes before checking her phone again. No new messages, just the last one. Lucas, running late. Start without me. She didn't order, didn't leave either. Just sat there, watching other people talk, laugh, exist in pairs that felt complete. Eventually, she stood up and walked out. The city air felt colder than it should have. She didn't call him, he didn't call her. The next day, he acted like nothing had happened. Hey, he said casually when she walked into the office, flashing that familiar, easy smile. Yesterday got crazy. Megan looked at him, studied him. You could have told me you weren't coming. I said I was running late. That's not the same thing. Lucas sighed lightly, like the conversation was already more effort than he wanted to give. Come on, Megan, it's not a big deal. Not a big deal? The words lingered longer than they should have, because once upon a time she had said the same thing, about different things, to a different person. Megan turned away first. Right, she said quietly. That night, she went back to Lucas's apartment, not because she wanted to, but because she didn't know what else to do. He was warm again, attentive, present in the way that had drawn her in from the beginning. But something had changed. Not in him, in her. She noticed the gaps now, the way conversation circled back to him, the way his attention came in waves, intense, then absent. The way nothing about this felt, steady. Stay tonight, Lucas said, pulling her closer. Megan hesitated. Not visibly, but enough. For the first time, the question surfaced clearly. What am I actually building here? Because this wasn't a life. It was moments, disconnected, unanchored, and for the first time, that wasn't enough. Days passed, then weeks. The tension didn't explode. It stretched, thin, fragile. Are we something? Megan asked one evening, standing near the window of his apartment. Lucas looked up from his phone. What do you mean? The question alone told her everything. I mean, what is this? She clarified. Lucas exhaled, running a hand through his hair. It's us. That's not an answer. He shrugged slightly. Does it need to be? Megan stared at him, and suddenly she saw it. Clearly. Painfully. Lucas had never promised her anything. Not really. Not in the way she had convinced herself he did. Everything she thought they were building had existed mostly in her own expectations. I left my marriage, she said quietly. Lucas frowned slightly. I didn't ask you to do that. The words landed harder than anything else, because he was right. Silence filled the room. Megan looked away, her chest tightening. For the first time, the reality of her choices stood in front of her unfiltered, undeniable. This wasn't a transition from one life to another, it was a fall, and there was nothing solid waiting at the bottom. That night she didn't stay, she went home. The house on Alder Street looked the same. Warm lights, clean lines, still. But inside, everything had changed. Adrian was in the living room, sitting in his usual chair, a book open in his hands. He looked up when she entered, not surprised, not curious, just aware. You're back early, he said. Megan nodded, slipping off her shoes slowly. Yeah. A pause. Everything okay? He asked. The question was simple, neutral, but it broke something open inside her. No, she said. The word felt heavier than anything she had said in weeks. Adrian closed his book, setting it aside. He didn't rush her, didn't push, just waited. Megan stepped further into the room, her arms crossing unconsciously, like she was trying to hold herself together. I thought it was something real, she said, her voice unsteady now. I thought it was going somewhere. Adrian said nothing. But it's not, she continued. It's just pieces. When it's convenient, when it fits. Her laugh was soft, empty. I gave up everything for that. The silence that followed wasn't judgmental. It wasn't cold. It was honest. Megan looked at him then, really looked. At the man who had never made her question where she stood. Who had been steady even when she stopped noticing it. Who had built a life with her, not just moments. I didn't realize, she whispered. Adrian met her eyes. What? How much you were holding everything together? The truth of it settled between them. Not romantic, not hopeful, just real. Megan's eyes filled, this time with tears she couldn't hold back. I thought I was choosing something better, she said. Something more. Adrian nodded slightly. And now? She swallowed. Now I think I just lost something real. The words hung in the air. Heavy, irreversible. Adrian didn't move closer, didn't reach for her. Because this wasn't a moment that could be fixed. It could only be understood. And understanding always comes too late. Megan stood there, in the quiet house that used to feel like home, realizing, piece by piece, the weight of what she had traded away. Not for love, not for something lasting, but for an illusion that couldn't survive the light. Time didn't heal anything. It clarified. 3 months later, Seattle moved the same way it always had. Gray mornings, soft rain, people carrying their lives between glass buildings and quiet homes. But for Adrian Cole, everything felt different. Not heavier, not lighter, just settled. The house on Alder Street was no longer his. He had left it behind without ceremony. No arguments, no last-minute reconsiderations. Just signatures, boxes, and the quiet understanding that some spaces no longer belonged to who you had become. Now, he lived in a smaller apartment overlooking Lake Union. Minimal, intentional. There were fewer things, but everything had purpose. A drafting table near the window, clean lines, open space, silence that didn't feel empty anymore. Adrian stood there most mornings with a cup of coffee, watching the water shift under the muted light. He had returned to his work. Not the safe projects, the ones that demanded attention, vision, risk. And for the first time in years, he felt present in his own life. His phone buzzed occasionally. Colleagues, clients, new opportunities. A different rhythm, a quieter one. Megan's name didn't appear anymore. Not because she hadn't tried, but because Adrian had made a decision. Not out of anger, not out of punishment, but out of clarity. Some endings weren't meant to be revisited. Across the city, Megan still lived in the house. Alone. At first, it had felt like control. Like she had kept something. The space, the structure, the familiarity. But over time, it became something else. An echo. The rooms felt larger now. Not physically, emotionally. Every corner held something she couldn't ignore. The kitchen where Adrian used to stand in the mornings. The living room where silence had once felt safe. The bedroom that now felt unfamiliar. Lucas was gone. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just gradually. His messages slowed, then stopped. No explanation. No closure. Just absence. At first, Megan told herself it didn't matter. That she had already seen it coming. that she had already let go. But the truth was harder to admit. It wasn't just Lucas she had lost. It was what she had believed he represented. Something new, something alive, something more. But what she had traded for it had been real, and now it was gone. One evening, Megan sat at the dining table, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She didn't remember making it. Her phone lay beside her, a message thread still open. Adrian. The last message she had sent weeks ago. Can we talk? No response. At first, that silence had frustrated her, confused her. Now, she understood it. Because Adrian's silence wasn't avoidance, it was closure, and that was something she couldn't argue with. She stood up slowly, walking toward the living room. Everything looked the same, exactly the same, and that was the problem, because she wasn't. Megan stopped near the window, looking out at the quiet street. For a moment, she let herself remember. Not the affair, not the excitement, but the ordinary things. Adrian handing her coffee in the morning. The way he listened, even when she thought he wasn't. The quiet consistency she had mistaken for something lacking. She had wanted intensity, something that made her feel seen. But she hadn't realized. She had already been seen, just not in the way she expected. A tear slipped down her cheek before she noticed it. Then another, because the truth had finally settled into place. Clear, unavoidable. Adrian hadn't lost her. She had lost him. And not to another person, but to his absence, to his indifference. Because anger, she realized now, would have meant something still existed. But this quiet, unwavering distance meant there was nothing left at all. Months later, on a cool morning, Adrian stood by the lake again. The city reflected softly in the water, distorted but steady. He took a sip of coffee, his gaze calm, grounded. There was no triumph in it, no sense of victory, just peace. He had let go, not just of Megan, but of the version of himself that had held on too long. And in its place, he had found something quieter, stronger, himself. Behind him, his phone buzzed once. A new message, a new name, a new possibility. Adrian glanced at it, then set the phone down without opening it. Not out of hesitation, but because for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to rush toward anything. Outside, the water moved slowly, unbothered, unaffected. And Adrian, standing there in the soft morning light, finally understood something that had taken him years to learn. Some endings don't break you, they free you.